Hi everyone, here we are today looking at our third video for the culture unit, what we're calling the spread and influence of culture, aka the basics, right, behind culture and how it spreads, how it diffuses over time. So that's going to be what we're looking at today. Now within culture, we have two types of diffusion that we're looking at. The first we call relocation diffusion, and this is when an idea spreads by people physically moving and migrating to a new area, and they take that culture, that idea, that whatever it may be with them as people physically move, right? So we have someone in one place and they move to another place, and that's how the idea spreads. On the other hand, we have what we call expansion diffusion, which is when an idea or whatever else it is we're talking about spreads outwardly from a hearth. And specifically this means that we're looking at an idea that is not going to spread because people are moving. That idea can spread without people moving at all. Right, and that's kind of the divide that we see here with relocation diffusion and expansion diffusion. These are the big umbrella terms. If it's relocation diffusion, then more often than not, the person who has that idea, that culture, that characteristic has to move in order for that characteristic to spread. In expansion diffusion, that's not the case. The idea, the characteristic, whatever it is we're talking about, can spread without people themselves moving with that idea or whatever it is. The way to think about relocation diffusion again, it's people moving to new locations, right? So we imagine this house as our idea or concept, and the people are physically moving to some new place and taking that with them, right? So if we think about the origins of maybe Asian cuisine in the United States, people of Asian descent and food of Asian origin is not from the United States, right? It's from Asia. It's a different continent, different space, different history entirely. So originally, at least, people from Asia and Chinese and people of Chinese descent in particular, for the US at least, had to first bring over that culture once they migrated. And that culture ended up in the US as a result of that relocation diffusion of people moving from one place to the other. Excuse me. Now in expansion diffusion we have a lot of different categories and types, one of these being contagious diffusion. Contagious diffusion is the rapid spread of an idea regardless of social class, economic status, or power. So no matter who you are, if the idea is spreading through contagious diffusion, it's going to affect you in some way. Right? So we can think of things like memes and YouTube videos, where as long as you have internet access, where the large majority of people do have internet access of some kind, they're able to interact with that idea. You can think even back to Vines and things like that. Right, TikTok would be the kind of in the now example that we look at, because whether you're the president of a country or a 14, 15-year-old kid in school looking at a culture video demonstration, you're going to be exposed to TikTok in some way. Right, you can access that same information. It's not blocked off by not having enough money or not having enough power or being in a specific location. The internet's had a lot to do with this contagious diffusion. Right, just having access to it, which makes it more available which makes ideas more available to people around the world. Our second type of expansion diffusion is what we call stimulus diffusion. And this one's a little tricky. This is where we have the spread of an idea, but we have the spread of the underlying concept or idea, not the entire idea itself. So if we think about TikTok videos, right, like we just said, that idea spreads completely. Right, whatever video, that we're looking at, that gets shared and transferred in whole, right? The stimulus diffusion that we're looking at is going to be something like food in other countries. It's a really good example, right? Especially conglomerates and globalized corporations of food products like McDonald's, right? Mickey D's. And we can see here we have all these different examples of food products from McDonald's, right? We're looking at all these products here, like the McVeggie, the McAloo Tiki, the Paneer Salsa Wrap, the Crispy Chinese, right, McCurry Pan, Pizza McPuff, all these things that we don't usually see at McDonald's, right, for those of us who frequent it, or those of you who frequent it, right, but in these other countries, they're going to have different menu items, right, compared to the US-based McDonald's restaurants. Even regionally, we may have different restaurants for McDonald's, right, it depends on where you are in the US, I'm supposing, but definitely when you go to different countries, especially countries that have a non-European influence, right, or have their own kind of ethnic identity, we're going to see these differentiations, right? This McVeggie in particular is a really good example, right? This is what we find in India, and India, as we've looked at with the other reviews in class, has a majority religion of Hinduism, and Hindus do not eat beef, right? And many opt for vegetarianism. So this McVeggie becomes the new standard, right, instead of a Big Mac, because people aren't really going to be eating beef, and McDonald's still wants to provide food because it wants to make money in these areas, so they have to adjust. They have to change the idea. It's still a McDonald's burger, right, this McVeggie, this McAlutiki, but it has to change slightly to fit the new culture, and that's what stimulus diffusion is all about. Our last type is hierarchical diffusion, right? Big word to say, but hierarchical diffusion is what we're looking at. And this is when we have a spread, of an idea in rank order, usually from a high rank to a low rank. And when we think about high and low ranks, we're thinking about power or influence. That can just be political power, so like something from the president to you or me, who don't really have a lot of political power compared to others. It could be a matter of influence in general, right? Like a big city to a small town. Or those big cities, they can start trends. We think of fashion trends. We can think of Milan or Paris, where we're going to have big fashion shows and new trends for the world. And then it'll slowly make its way down to Pearland or Far, Texas, right? And in that way, we see this diffusion from a larger influence or a larger influential area to these lower areas of influence. Hip-hop, rap music started this way too, right? Starting in boroughs within NYC, sorry, not newly industrialized country, like newly industrialized York, NYC, and then spreading out to other areas, right? Because that was the heart of hip-hop and eventually what becomes these different genres of rap and hip-hop music. Now, altogether, we have theories about how culture spreads, which is our diffusions that we just talked through. But there are also theories about what causes culture in the first place, what makes culture the way it is. Right? And there are two broad theories that try to answer this question of what determines human culture and society. The first theory we call environmental determinism. And according to this theory, the environment entirely or completely determines human cultures and behaviors. So the cultures and behaviors that a certain group has is entirely determined, was entirely dependent upon the environmental or physical conditions, right? So if you have a society that wears light clothing and linens and things like that, that's because their environment was climatically warm or tropical, or a humid climate that required them or determined them to wear those types of clothing items, and that became part of their culture. On the other hand, we have environmental possibilism, or just possibilism for short, where we do agree that there's some influence of the environment on culture, right? The environment is going to play a role in what people do behaviorally, culturally, but humans ultimately determine what their culture and society is going to look like on their own. All right, so we have these two different theories about how culture develops, and we can look at different examples like food preferences, right, where we have examples for both of these theories. Right? If we think about food preference, it might lean towards a determinist view, especially if we think about coastline or coastal areas, where their food preferences and their cultural traditions, their famous foods are probably going to be seafood, right, shrimp or fish, or shellfish or something of that kind. Because they were near the coast originally, that's where their culture grew up, right, indigenous or not. But for however many decades or hundreds of years or thousands of years, and that eventually ingrained itself in the culture, right? And so you could argue that deterministically, that coastal access influenced their culture such that they have preferences for seafood as opposed to other food, or that that was the most popular food in their culture to begin with. Right. Now, outside of these theories, we still have to categorize culture itself, whether it's possibilist or determinist. And there are really three ways that we can categorize culture, as we call it, right? We have things like folk culture, and folk culture being practiced generally by small homogeneous groups in isolated or rural areas. And this is originally how folk culture may start, right? It's going to start in these small groups of similar ethnic or historically tied groups, and they're usually want to be away from other populations, right? So that culture is going to develop on its own. Now, we have these considerations that folk culture is practiced by small homogeneous groups, but pop culture is practiced by heterogeneous groups, and these are really opposites that we're looking at here. So when we think about pop culture, we're thinking about this opposite end for folk. Now, there is a difference between folk culture and what we call indigenous culture, right? Lots of folk cultures are, every indigenous culture could qualify as a folk culture, but not every folk culture qualifies as an indigenous culture. And the difference is this: with an indigenous culture, it's practiced specifically by a native or indigenous group or descendants of that original group. So this is where we think of kind of indigenous Asian groups, indigenous African groups, indigenous European or American groups, right? North and South America included. So you're thinking of like Mayan culture or Aztec culture, things like that, right? These would fall into these indigenous cultural contexts. Now, the difference between indigenous and folk, to use an example, the Amish in the United States are a folk culture. That group is mostly homogenous. They tend to live in rural areas away from other populations. And their culture hasn't really changed over time. But the Amish were not indigenous to the United States. They were not original parts of the population back before colonization and back before other migration had occurred, right? If you're thinking about the development of human culture in general and human populations in general. The Mayan cultures, the Aztec cultures, these grew out of indigenous populations and were in part of the indigenous populations of these areas. That's the difference we're looking at here. Of course, pop culture is practiced by heterogeneous groups, by multitudes of cultures. It doesn't matter what the culture is, and we tend to see pop culture diffused over large areas. Specifically, we're looking at global scales, or this globalization, and the internet has a lot to do with that. Right, the faster that we can get communication going, the more that we change, the more that we decrease space-time compression or increase space-time compression, right? Make the world feel like it's smaller, even though it's not, because we can send information so fast. The more pop culture is going to be diffused. Now, the easy ways to know when it's folk, the easy checklist to think of is one, it doesn't spread very far from the hearth. So that culture is not going to spread very far from where it originated. So if we think about folklorico, right, in Mexico, that really hasn't spread far from the hearth of Mexico itself, right? We may see it pop up in places where we have Mexican culture in general, because Mexican populations or people of Mexican descent migrated to those areas, but aside from that, we're not going to see it very far from its hearth, from its original point. Second, it stays within that specific group and culture. Now, this doesn't mean that we're not having people learn about the culture, because I'm sure that there are people who are not of Mexican descent who know about folklorico, but that doesn't mean that they're going to practice it themselves. It doesn't mean that it's part of their own ancestral history or ethnic history themselves. Thirdly, it remains static. It doesn't really change, and folklorico is one of these good examples, again, that hasn't really changed. The style of dance, the purpose behind the dancing has tended to remain as static as possible, to stay true to the origins of the practice, belief, etc. And we're going to see folk culture tend to do that. It's going to stay, again, static. It's not really going to change over time, to preserve that, maybe not authenticity, but that accuracy, rather, right, of when it was first originally introduced. When it was first originally, it's oxymoron, repetitive, right, when it was originally introduced. Now, with cultures in general, we're looking for a number of different influences, and we looked at religion and language in the other two videos, but the big picture is going to be about distribution, which is going to tell us where the culture is and how or why it ended up in that place, right? Where are the cultural practices, the religion, the language, the belief, the food systems, the clothing, what have you, and how did it get there and why did it get there, right? What caused that distribution? Because we've already looked at the fact that culture diffuses from place to place. We want to know the process, how it ended up in that new location. Now, there are lots of different aspects to culture we can look at, from language to food to traditions, beliefs, art, and clothing. All of these can fit into what we call a culture complex that creates the, quote-unquote culture of an area. We don't need to focus on all of these all at once, at least not all the time, but the ones that we're generally going to see most often are things like language, traditions, and beliefs, which can include religious practices or spiritual practices, and art and food, right? These are going to be kind of important factors. All of these are going to be important factors for culture, but there are some that we see more than others, at least in this course. Now, for the United States, because that's one of the focuses, right, culture and distributions of culture in the U.S., there are four major ethnic groups that we look at. Hispanic Americans, African Americans, Native Americans, and Asian Americans. Right, now, some of these we can categorize into racial categories, or at least the U.S. Census, right, which is going on right now, categorizes some of these into racial categories. The key here is Hispanic American is a true ethnicity, right? There's not a race of Hispanic Americans that usually falls into some other category. Now, this is not saying the U.S. Census is perfect, right? There are issues therein, but that's a separate video, not this one. Now, for Hispanics in the U.S., naturally we have concentrations in the southwestern United States, and that's specifically because we have a border with a majority Hispanic country, which is Mexico, right? In case you're wondering, right? Not Canada. Canada's not majority Hispanic, but Mexico is. And so when we think about migration, and when we looked at migration, right, people are looking to move the shortest distance possible. Even if we do have migrants from Central and South America, most of those migrants are going to end up in the closest place, at the closest place possible to their source country or source location. And what that means, at least for migration over the last 300-ish years, 400-ish years really, into what became the United States, is that we have a settlement pattern and a cluster distribution of Hispanics in the southwestern part of the U.S., right along that border. Now we have other clusters too, right here in Florida, right? This is for Cuba, right? We had a lot of Cuban immigrants that came in here during the 50s, 60s, 70s. And up here in the Northeast, we have some more clusters, and usually we see these clusters from the Dominican Republic and Haiti, just different causes and rationales for why a population ends up where it does. Now, of course, there's a difference here between Hispanic and Latino that needs to be discussed, that needs to be talked about, right? Because Hispanic and Latino are not interchangeable terms. Hispanic is going to be the most inclusive, and that's also going to include, and the Hispanic category will include Mexico, the rest of Central America, all of South America. Brazil is tricky. Usually we're not going to count Brazil, plus Spain. Right, those are going to count as our Hispanic categories. Latino specifically refers to people descended from or people of Latin America, which is only going to include South America and Central America, including Mexico. All right, this is just a general thing you want to know. Now, in total, the Hispanics comprise about 17% of the U.S. population. It's by far the largest ethnic group that we have in the United States. The largest minority group that we have in the United States. Our second group, African Americans, people of African descent or African American descent. And there's a difference here, right, between African American, right? Here we're looking at a cluster in the South and Southeastern United States, the Southern and Southeastern United States, right? And we have histories there from transatlantic slave trade, or this is where most African slaves ended up, and then over time, past independence and past Civil War, past emancipation, et cetera, we see clusters stay, again, relatively in the same locations as where original forced migrants first arrived, right? And we have about 13.3% of the population that identify as African American as of the last, data trend, or we'll see these numbers change with the census again. But that's also why we look at these clusters, right? And these ethnic distributions are going to influence the landscapes in which we see, right? So if we think back to the Hispanic Americans, we're going to see a lot more Spanish-influenced culture, right? Not just Spanish, like ethnic culture, but Spanish language culture in specific, right? We'll see more signage, we'll see more restaurants that reflect a Mexican or Latin American or Hispanic culture in the southwestern United States compared to any other place in the U.S. Same with the African American distribution. Here we had a multitude of influences, right? Mostly we had English influence and African influence because of colonization and the forced migration of slaves to the southern and southeastern United States. But in Louisiana, for example, we had French influence from that original Louisiana Purchase and slaves who were also brought into this region of the world. And we see this blend of French and African culture where we end up with things like Creole, right, as a culture or ethnicity. And then eventually food styles and languages and things that develop out of that, right? And that's only going to happen because these specific cultures, originally African culture and French culture, blended and fused in the same spaces. For our Asian Americans, we have two specific locations for our Asian American clusters. We have here in the western U.S., or mainly in California along that west coast, and then in the northeast as well. Now, we only have about 5.6% as of this data identifying as Asian American, and you have to keep in mind that Asian American includes more than just Chinese and Japanese, Korean, right? Those are all Asian identities and Asian ethnicities, but Asia is a large continent, right? And technically, those of the Middle East, or those sourced from the Middle East, also could identify as Asian, right? The Southwest Asia is the kind of synonymous term for the Middle East. So we're thinking of also people who identify ethnically as Indian, as Filipino, as Pakistani, Bangladeshi. We have a lot of groups that fall into this category. Even then, we only have about 5.6% of the U.S. population identifying as Asian American. All right, but again, this is also going to be reflective in that landscape. We're going to see these cultures blend and fuse, and we'll see much more Asian influence or Asian cultural influence in these two areas than anywhere else in the U.S. Houston is also a hot spot for Asian migration, especially for Vietnamese migration, right? So for those of you who love, I can never remember how to say it, by the way, it's La Crawfish or LA Crawfish. I think it's LA because the L and the A are in capital letters. I digress. You have Vietnamese and Cajun fusion to thank for that restaurant if you like it. Our final group, and unfortunately the smallest group, and ironically the smallest group, are our Native or Indigenous Americans. We have main concentrations in Alaska, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and the Dakotas, what we would call the reservations now. And we historically, you think back to 8th grade, Trail of Tears was a big part of this. Forced migration of, Indigenous Americans out of their original homes in the western United States, in the eastern United States, especially the southeastern United States, with the Cherokee. And only about 2% of the population today identifies as Native or Indigenous American for all the variety of tribes and specific ethnic groups that we have. Right? It's, again, a sad reflection of the history of North America, given that at one point 100% of people in this space would have identified as Indigenous or Native American, and it's changed drastically over time. All of this and all culture ends up being an influence on what we call the cultural landscape, the way that the environment is influenced or representative of human culture, cultural practices. Now, sometimes it's as simple as signage, right? Looking at a sign like this one on the street or at the corner of a building and seeing part of the responses or part of the information in one language, like English, and the other in the native language. I think in this case we're looking at the Cyrillic alphabet, so probably Russian, as what we're seeing here. Right, just reflecting one, the native culture of that place, which is likely Russian, and then the globalized culture that's become so dominant over the years, which is English. Sometimes it's about the food practices, right? Foods that only would come about through migration and fusions. So here, cilantro, one of my favorites, right? A very good Austin food truck now, a restaurant on its own. I think they were on Shark Tank, I read that somewhere. This was a few years ago, but now they have a full restaurant where we have this blend of Korean and Mexican fusion. We have this blending of two cultures that only could have happened if those two cultures met and interacted with each other. And other times it's the architecture, right? Seeing different spaces peppered by buildings, the likes of which we may never see in our lives if we never end up in a space that has these buildings, or which we've only dreamed of seeing because of their beauty, their difference, their deference to whims of creativity and architectural prowess, right? From the different churches that we see for Christianity, whether it's an Eastern Orthodox church or a traditional church itself, whether we're looking at something like a monastery, a Buddhist pagoda, or a Muslim mosque, right? We have all sorts of impacts on the landscape and on the way that our lives are lived, and all of this has to do with us and the culture that we carry with us. Here's hoping this was helpful to you. Hoping you're happy, healthy, well, and safe during this time, and we'll see you next time.